precious. And the last line of the Psalm, Psalm 72, God's chosen one will treat their blood, the blood of the oppressed, as precious. This psalm, as Richard said, was probably for the coronation of a king. And as we heard in our call to worship, and as we all know, we are not ruled by a king, but still the themes from this psalm are part of the bedrock of our faith. They show us what it is that God values in leadership and in society. And what that is holding the lives of the vulnerable as precious. Caring for the oppressed, for the poor, hearing the cries of those who are in pain and suffering. And what does it mean to hold those lives as precious? We talked about that a little bit already, about holding things and people's lives as valuable, treating them maybe like they are as wonderful as children are, holding things and them and carefully like a baby or like a tender plant that has just sprouted. Giving sustenance and nurture, like the psalm talks about justice and peace showering down upon the people. What we saw this week in the US Capitol and throughout the country was not holding life as precious. There was a Confederate flag in the US Capitol. In Michigan, at their state capitol, a cross was erected. And the people there and in the US Capitol with their Confederate flags and Nazi symbols, I think were violently purporting the kind of vision of a world that we've seen become more open in the last few years. A vision of a world where there's not enough for everyone and where people who are white are the ones who deserve the resources that there are, and where those who are not white or different in any way are held to be less than and not deserving of the basic quality of life. And yet we know that God's vision for a world is not that vision. I think perhaps those rioters have some sort of distorted vision of this world and of this psalm. I think some argue that the rioters, white supremacists, that they are the ones who are oppressed somehow by the changes in our culture, by people from backgrounds different from them, by immigrants, by whoever. And yet, what I saw and what called to my heart on Wednesday as things were unfolding was the brutal knowledge that if that crowd of rioters had been Black or brown, things would have unfolded quite differently. They would have not made it probably into the Capitol. They would have been shot, arrested immediately. And yet, because these rioters were white men mostly, they were able to do what they did. There were politicians taking selfies with them, helping them get in, egging them on, encouraging them. I think there's some who say, well, the Black Lives Matter protesters have been treated like they had the red carpet. In fact, I saw someone say that on Facebook last night. People who deny that people are treated differently because of the color of their skin. People who say that racism does not exist anymore. But however some may try to explain it away, there it was on display on Wednesday. The difference of how white people are treated and how those who protest for racial justice were treated over the summer when they were shot with tear gas, rubber bullets, real bullets, put in tight corners by riot police, arrested almost without question. The world that has been reflected back to us this week, and really this past year, the past few years, is a world that God wishes were otherwise. Racism, white supremacy are unfortunately very real, and they are not God's will for this world. God calls us to treat life as precious, to treat the oppressed as precious. And perhaps one place to start is figuring out who are the oppressed. One of the problems we're facing in society is that we don't agree on a basic narrative. It feels almost as if we are living in two different versions of the world. And so to figure out who are the oppressed, who are the vulnerable, different groups of people have different answers for that. So what then are we to do when it seems like we can't agree on the basic nature of reality? How can we figure out who is vulnerable and work towards the world that God desires for us? I don't have an answer to our division. If I did, I would have shared it with the world already. But this psalm for this week helps me to think in a new way about what it means to care for one another and to work towards that world. Holding life as precious perhaps is a way to care for the vulnerable, to bring more justice, more peace. Now, I do want to put a spin on that though, because when we think about holding life as precious, holding the vulnerable as precious, we might think about avoiding conflict or handling people at a distance, or just, sort of going along to get along, ignoring issues, ignoring people's bad behavior, ignoring the fact that people are being beset by conspiracy theories and spouting off things that are not true. But holding life as precious maybe means something deeper, or we could think about it in a sort of slanted way. In that video, there was the image of people or just tiny plants growing. And if you think about a tiny plant, you do have to be gentle with it, but you also have to be attentive to it. You have to be engaged with it. Small plants need care. If they don't get the sun and the water that they need, if they are crowded out by other weeds, they will not make it. So holding life as precious is not just holding things or people at a distance, but being actively engaged in a gentle way. Love and accountability do go together. When we love people enough, we are not afraid to say, or maybe we are afraid, but we do it anyway. We are able to say to people when their behavior is causing harm, or when we're worried about them, rather than just, again, going along to get along. Holding love and accountability together is perhaps the hardest part of love. I talked last week, and some of you know, maybe you've seen me post, but I got a dog. Our family got a dog right before Christmas, which has been an adventure. This is the first dog that I have ever owned in my entire life, and we do not know what we are doing. Now, he's a very sweet dog, but he has some behavioral issues. You know, we got him from the shelter. He's kind of a puppy, but not really a puppy. And so we've been trying to figure out, how do we train him to act right and to not do these behaviors. Now, one thing that he kind of does, if anybody has any advice on this, I'd be happy to hear it later. But if Blake or I pick up Lydia, our 4.5-year-old daughter, the dog he can't handle it. And I don't know if he's possessive of us or possessive of Lydia, but he'll nip at her. And so, you know, then we get all worried about Lydia and tense. And the first reaction is to yell at the dog or to shove him, you know, violently aside. But this dog, because I don't know why, it's just who he is, that kind of big energy, that kind of fearfulness or anxiety, he then wants to play. And so it just amps him up even more. So the other day I started watching this show called The Dog Whisperer with this world-renowned dog trainer. And what he talks about is correcting dogs by being calm and assertive. And I don't know how he does it, but he just, with his body, just, you know, he'll just point at the dog and the dog will go where he points. He doesn't yell. He will, you know, physically correct a dog, but without the kind of anger and fear associated with yelling. Somehow dogs just listen to him. So calm and assertive is what he says. It's about energy, he says, that just by your energy, you can influence a dog's behavior. Now, people, of course, are not dogs, but that experience of working with this dog and thinking about holding life as precious has made me think about how to be calm and assertive in our relations with the world, in our relations with our faith, and to standing up for the things that we believe in. How do we hold life as precious? To be gentle, but also authoritative, to be assertive, but to not be angry. That, I think, is one of the challenges before us when there are those who use our Christian symbols, like they did in Michigan and elsewhere, as symbols right alongside and enmeshed with the symbols of white supremacy. How will we speak a different note? Calmly and assertively, but without anger. God calls us to be like this king in Psalm 72, to hold life as precious, which again means to be gentle and calm, but also engaged with one another, to give sustenance to all. And sometimes that sustenance includes setting boundaries, holding people accountable, including ourselves, doing things and having conversations that may be difficult. That is some of the hardest work I know, as it is with the dog, because it's so much easier to yell. Kids are the same way. If you have experience with small children, it's much easier to yell than to contain your anger and to respond in a patient, teaching, authoritative manner. These lives are precious, and God calls us to treat the world and each other as precious. Amen.